I'm joined today by Andrew Enns, Executive Vice President for Leger. Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Harold, great to be connecting again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's terrific. Well, your firm is out again this week with a latest poll on the federal election, and in terms of BC numbers, we're going to talk about BC numbers today. It's very much similar to some of the national numbers we're seeing. The Mark Carney and the Liberals are still well ahead of Poilievre and the Conservatives, 41% to 33% in BC. What really jumps out at me is the gender gap, where you've got Poilievre trailing Carney by 3%, which is kind of within the margin of error. But when it comes to women, Poilievre is way behind.
Yeah.
It seems to account for really this not being a race.
Well, for for sure, it's it's a factor. And I think I'll say this that Mr. Poilievre, when he became the leader of the party, he had a style. It was a fairly aggressive style, well suited for opposition politics, and quite frankly, well suited for the 2022, 23, 24 period. We had a prime minister who, when he was first elected prime minister, had a significant gender advantage over his opponents. Back in the day, Mr. Trudeau initially had a very strong appeal with with female voters, but that dissipated and it changed dramatically when the inflation crisis sort of hit, Harold. I mean, no secret, but female heads of the household tend to be much more engaged in the budget activities. They're keeping track of things. They often manage the bills. They do a lot of the shopping, the grocery shopping. I mean, I'm not trying to be overly sexist here, but that's still the case in many instances. And as such, they were attuned to what was going on out there in terms of inflation and the cost of things, and trying to manage the budget and still do all the things they do for their kids. And so the views soured heavily against the Liberal government, against Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Poilievre took advantage of that. And by doing so, he was able to close that gap. Still a very aggressive, brash kind of approach. But we hit the end of 2024, and I'm sure you've talked about this already. Like things changed. Like the lens has changed for the voter. We are now looking for somebody who people aren't as angry anymore, as opposed to, in some cases, they're quite worried. They're anxious about their potentially their jobs. They're anxious about what this might do for the cost of things in stores. And it's not an anger now. It's a worry and a concern. And as such, people want a different level of sort of that response from their leaders. And the angry brashness of Mr. Poilievre isn't quite connecting. And they want, and clearly Mr. Carney's more stable, confident kind of approach is providing that level of comfort, particularly with those female voters. And I think that's what's suddenly created this significant gender gap in terms of the large gap between female voters and Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre. And I will say, it's interesting. The gap is driven largely by older female voters over the age of 50, 55. They've very often they were the last ones to hang on with the Liberal government, and they've gone back in significant numbers. And I will say, where the NDP still have some measure of support demographically is amongst that young female voter, 18 to 34, 18 to 30. And also, the Liberals have clawed back some of that vote. So that's now become kind of a double whammy for the Conservatives. So that really pushes that gender gap at those two age extremes.
Right. Well, I didn't mention the NDP earlier, but they really have tanked relative to what they were polling in the last federal election.
Yeah, it's that, honestly. I mean, you started off the conversation about sort of the trouble that the Conservative parties currently having and how they're trailing significantly in British Columbia. The reality is the Conservative Party vote is actually not that bad compared to where they were in 2021 in British Columbia. I think, quite frankly, at where they're at, they wouldn't be that disappointed. But the problem is that the NDP traditionally are in the, high 20s, sometimes low 30s in terms of support in British Columbia. I mean, British Columbia is one of their strongest regions in the country. And for them to be polling, I mean, our poll has them at 8% in British Columbia.
Right.
It's, and that vote has largely, I'm not going to say exclusively, but that vote has largely drifted to the Liberals. And so, where the Conservatives, saying, hey, we're in pretty good shape at 38%. Yeah, but the Liberals are almost 50%. They're at 48%. And so that's largely on the backs of NDP voters who have, for a variety of reasons, have abandoned the NDP. And at this stage of the game, I mean, I'm sure both Mr. Singh and Mr. Poilievre are quite happy that we're not having a vote tomorrow. They need some time.
Right. Well, that said, your poll also found that I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of people say their vote is not going to change between now and election.
It's fairly it's not, that's not a high number, but it is significant. I mean, it's certainly it's noteworthy that and BC's a little bit higher than what the national average is, so that's sort of interesting. The only thing I'll say about this, Harold, is that I look at the vote. I call it stickiness, like how stuck are they on their current choice, and I will say we've got the question we ask, and people have told us what they plan to do. I also look at what's been happening in the last couple months. People's vote is on the move. I mean, we have seen extraordinary movement in the polls in the last 2.5 months. And I would suggest that I could have asked this question, how confident are you going to vote for the person that you're currently supporting? And I probably would have got over 50, probably close to 60% 2 months ago. The reality is, I mean, I think people have changed their mind once and moved to a party. That does make things more volatile in terms of the potential for things to move again at some point. If there is some sort of event or something happens, I think these are still a little bit unpredictable times. I mean, it's been said before, the flip and the change in the polling is extraordinary. I 100% agree. I've never seen it before in my 25 years in the business. And I'm not sure that the book on this one is yet finished. There still might be some more pages to fill in. So we'll see.
The other interesting, bunch of interesting questions. The other interesting question you asked, where you asked people to rate folks, Carney and Poilievre in particular, on a scale of 1 to 10 on a couple of different traits, I guess. What did you find there?
Well, I thought it was, well, first of all, it was interesting where, Mr. Carney is doing, in his party, is performing much better than Mr. Poilievre in terms of, winning the confidence of voters. But when it comes to the personalities, I was a little surprised there wasn't a bit more difference on some of the questions. Like we asked the question, who's more patriotic, and didn't see a big difference between the two, even though, I think there's some of what's driving that Liberal vote is a little bit of this patriotic nationalist kind of fervor about we're defending Canada, and that we like what we see of the Liberals in terms of what they're saying about Mr. Trump and things like that. But and there has been some criticisms of Mr. Poilievre of being too American, kind of pro-Trump and stuff like that. But from a patriotic standpoint, not big differences. I think on the other one where I didn't see big differences was, we asked the Canadians, like, which leader is more in touch, on a scale of 1 in 10. Is Mr. Carney more in touch with, real Canadians, or is Mr. Poilievre? And again, didn't see a great deal of difference. And I think on that one, I think the Conservatives will be disappointed in that, because they have made efforts to try to, paint Mr. Carney as being, kind of an elitist business person, European, hasn't lived in Canada in over a decade kind of thing. And it doesn't appear to have sort of stuck with voters at this stage of the game. And then I think the one that's probably probably again more problematic for the Conservatives is we asked a question for Mr. Carney, how much is he similar or different to Justin Trudeau? Because obviously the Conservatives were trying to paint him as just like Justin kind of thing. And on that note, it's pretty split, not really anything overwhelming. And then on the flip side, we asked how much Pierre Poilievre is like Mr. Trump, because obviously the Liberals are trying to attack Mr. Poilievre as being a kind of the Trump light sort of figure. And that one, I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not great for the Conservatives. It's like over half in British Columbia I sort of associate saying that he's more like Trump than than people who say he's different, which isn't good news for the Conservatives, because obviously that's something that in this current environment, I mean, that's the kiss of death. So it is interesting. There's some more warning signs, I think, for the Conservatives at this stage of the game. But I found it overall not kind of interesting that there's not major differences between the leaders, and yet one leader is clearly doing much better than the other at this stage of the game.
Yeah, very interesting. And then when the other question was around the disclosure of Mark Carney's business interests, and 2/3 of people in BC think he should come clean on that. So that, again, the Conservatives are going after him and the NDP are going after him on that.
Well, yeah, for sure. And I think, again, the Conservatives would look at that, and likewise, certainly Mr. Singh, which he can use any, any bolt of good news that he could find, would say, aha, we've got him. Well, yeah, but I'm not sure the voters really are, affixing a whole lot of importance to it at this stage of the game. So you may have to, I think, for both opposition parties, I think the lesson here would be, yes, you're on the right track, but you need to connect this somehow to what's the implication of him not doing so. Like, is this, apart from being maybe a bit obstinate about sharing his personal financial affairs, is there an implication in terms of his fitness for office or managing the country? I think that's probably, if they're going to pursue this line, they'll need to do something a little better if they think they're going to be able to chip away at Liberal vote.
Right. Zeroing in again on BC, what are your takeaways in terms of the regional vote splits?
Yeah, well, it's definitely interesting. I mean, I'll say this, Harold. There's a lot of operatives and strategists in British Columbia that are scratching their head right now, because most of the vote models and things that they are accustomed to looking at when they position sort of current trends has a floor of NDP vote of somewhere in around probably 20%. And like, we're way below that. And what that does now to vote splits in some of these key battleground ridings is really interesting. So I would say that the biggest battleground, I would say, in British Columbia always seems to be that sort of rest of Lower Mainland, Surrey, Burnaby, Coquitlam's. And right now, I would say the Conservatives aren't thrilled with where they're sitting. They're trailing the Liberals badly. The NDP have almost disappeared in that region, which is shocking. I mean, they win seats,
especially considering we just had a provincial election here 5-6 months ago, and
exactly.
The NDP won.
Well, and that's a great point. We should come back to before we go, Harold, because it's really interesting how there's been a total divorce of provincial versus federal tendencies. But certainly the lower mainland is tough for the Conservatives, and even Metro. Again, Metro is not as lucrative a spot for electoral seats for the Conservatives, but there's a couple there, and they won't be. They'll be working hard to see what's going on in those specific ridings. I mean, for Mr. Singh personally. I mean, I looked at he's in a kind of a new riding that's been created there. I mean, I looked at the overlay of what that would have done in 2021, and he would have won that seat by about 3,000 votes, I think. But where they're currently at now, I would suggest that he's fighting for his political life or electoral political life in that riding for sure. And then I think the other really interesting spot is the island. The island's often a bit of a mishmash of three parties kind of duking it out, um, and again, it looks like, I mean, the NDP haven't. They still have, it looks like, some level of support on the island. It's their highest region in British Columbia at 14%, which isn't saying much, but still, I would think the Conservatives might smell some opportunity in the northern part of the island where they tend to compete more directly with the NDP. And then I would think that, there might be like, in the Nanaimos and some of those seats, the Liberals will be sort of wondering about their potential in some of those now with that NDP collapse.
Perhaps even in Victoria.
Exactly. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Like, so no, it would be, right now, the Liberals would be looking at obviously some pickups. The Tories will be looking to protect what they have and probably not looking to be overly aggressive. And the NDP will be like doing some homework to see what do we save? What can we save in this thing?
Right. So how do you explain the disconnect between the provincial results and these federal numbers?
Well, it's really interesting, and it's not just a BC phenomenon. Look, I mean, I'm in Manitoba. Wab Kinew is he's near the top in terms of most popular premiers, and the NDP are very, very strong provincially here. And a local poll came out here and had the NDP down in like single digits federally. Wow. So it's same thing in Ontario with Doug Ford Conservatives just won an election 2 months ago and swept the province almost. I mean, a very strong election, and the Conservatives are trailing the Liberals by 10 points in Ontario federally. I think it's I mean, I would suggest there's a couple of factors at play. One, it's really the tariff issue, the U.S. trade aggression really is a strong hand for incumbents. It really played. I mean, Doug Ford played it masterfully, called an early election, batted off any complaints about that. The opposition couldn't get a word in on the tariff side of things, and I think we see that in terms of this federal campaign. Mr. Poilievre, Mr. Singh are just having a really hard time getting in on the conversation on the biggest issue of the campaign right now, which is the tariffs. And I think in particular, Mr. Singh probably is feeling the effects of basically kind of almost sort of disappearing a little bit in kind of getting folded into his support for the Liberal government for so long. And he just, right. I mean, he would claim victory on things, but he never made the announcements. It was always government ministers coming and saying, we're going to do pharmacare, we're going to do the dental care plan, and big announcements. And I think a lot of NDPers, I think, we saw it in some of our polling. There was sort of a soft erosion of NDP vote nationally. And Mr. Singh, in terms of personally, I think he personally took on the sort of the position as I'm propping up Mr. Trudeau and the government in terms of, my deal with him. It was a deal between, he was always leading the charge. I think that may have hurt him with some NDP, voters who are going, well, like we haven't really seen you in terms of what you've been doing. You've been more worried about keeping the Liberal power. We'll just vote for the Liberals. And I do think that that's a little speculation on my part, sure. Harold, but certainly sure. I do feel that that was a bit of a contributing factor to the fact that, the bottom appears to have fallen out in their support, at least at the moment. We'll see what happens in the next 3 weeks.
Well, I'm sure all the parties, I mean, I know they all have their own internal polling, and given that how accurate Leger has been over the years in their polling, it must be showing similar numbers. So with that in mind, when we get back together a week from now, what do you think, what should viewers be looking for in terms of messaging from the parties?
Well, I think you're going to see the Liberals look, they've got a formula that's working right now. I think you'll still see lots of talk. I mean, obviously, in an hour or two, I guess we'll know what's going to hit us with respect to tariffs.
Right.
And I think that'll probably dominate, certainly the next few days, if not the next week of the campaign in terms of, the commentary. And Mr. Carney, that's not a bad thing for him. Depending on, there'll be some reaction with respect to retaliatory tariffs. I think for Mr. Poilievre, there's obviously the weekend papers were awash with lots of good advice from the armchair quarterbacks and the insiders, and claiming campaign is in crisis and spiraling. I don't put a lot of stock in those sorts of things. I do think the Conservative campaign is not happy with the current situation. I'm sure our polling with BC and Ontario, those key battlegrounds for them, will not be welcome news. And as you say, I suspect their internals aren't going to be entirely different, and so they'll be looking hard to hone that message. I think Mr. Poilievre will likely sort of push on a broader economic and growing the Canadian economy, strengthen the economy. You'll see him a bit more aggressive in terms of, he won't try to go toe to toe with Mr. Carney in terms of what he would do with Donald Trump, but what he'll do is he'll try to position himself as the better leader to strengthen the economy, to get the government, get the country back on track. And in doing so, we'll try to remind voters that, hey, 3 months ago, you were really unhappy with the direction of the country. You were really unhappy with the current government. And there was a real sentiment for change. And I think you're going to hear some of that, but wrapped up in terms of the kind of the defending Canada against tariffs as well, because it's, it is very topical. And Mr. Singh, I mean, he just has to make some progress. I mean, he really just has to, find a way to insert himself more vigorously in this campaign and in the views of voters. They're definitely going to want to, both parties are going to want to see, we're 3 weeks out. Soon we'll be 2 weeks out. And we'll be one. The runway is kind of, the end of the runway is coming up. So you do need to see some sort of closure or some movement in some of the polls. It doesn't have to change overnight, but you want to be able to show some progress that what you're doing is having an impact. And then obviously, we've got debates coming up. Those will be important events potentially, and then we'll see from there.
Right. Well, definitely lots to watch, lots to think about. Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problem. Always enjoy the conversation. It's good to do it with you again.